On this day, the temperature dropped to record levels. It had not been that cold for years. But it was Richard's birthday, and George wanted to go to Richard's birthday party. So he brought a present for his friend, a cake in the shape of a carrot. Peppa couldn't go with him. She was ill and Mummy Pig had to look after her.
Daddy Pig, are you sure you want to go? I have a bad feeling about this. The weather report said it's dangerous to drive in this snowfall.
No need to worry. I've driven in worse weather. I'll call you when I arrive.
Mummy Pig trusted him and wrapped George in clothes. Daddy Pig put on some quite warm clothes, but they turned out to be not meant for this weather. They went outside and got in the car. Daddy Pig drove to Richard's house. The drive must have been about an hour. The car stalled. He decided that it wasn't far to the rabbit's house and they could just walk there. Otherwise, they might freeze in the car. He took the present and matches and walked with George. After a few minutes of walking, he was already starting to feel his nose and cheekbones going numb. George was walking behind him. He was quite warm in his clothes. The visibility was getting worse, but they had to keep moving to make it. Daddy Pig wished he had worn something warmer. He realized that he would freeze his nose and cheeks, which would hurt for several days. The snowstorm was over. By now he should have reached the rabbit's house, but looking around he realized he was in an unknown place. The tracks had been covered, but he didn't panic yet. He realized that if he walked in one direction, he could reach a road that would take him to some settlement, and maybe even someone would drive by and rescue them. As he walked, he thought about the fact that this frost was the worst he had ever encountered. Suddenly, George said he was hungry. The only food was the present he had for Richard. Daddy Pig took off his gloves, unwrapped the present. It took no more than 15 seconds, and yet his fingers were numb. As he held the cake in his hands, he realized it was hard as a rock. He definitely needed to start a fire. While he was thinking about it, his toes went numb from the cold. He got scared and started pacing back and forth to warm them. He stomped until he felt the warmth returning. He stacked the wood, got matches, and very carefully started a fire. Warming themselves by the fire, they finished the cake. He thought he was going to be a few hours late. As soon as they moved away from the fire, he felt that frost again. But he felt he could still walk for a long time. With his weight, he broke through the crust of ice. He didn't notice the pond in front of him. This brought out Daddy Pig. This problem would delay him another hour. He knew he had to dry his clothes immediately. It is impossible to warm feet if they are wet. As he built the fire, he took off his glove and his fingers were instantly numb. It was strange to him how his hands behaved from the cold. It was as if they no longer belonged to his body. When he touched a branch, he had to look at his hand to make sure he had actually grabbed it. The fire was getting hotter. In a minute, he would be able to lay thick boughs, and then he would throw off his wet shoes and warm his feet by the fire. It was his fault. He should not have put the fire under the fir tree, for there was a lot of snow on it. Daddy Pig was scared, as if he had heard his own death sentence. For about a minute, he sat there without moving, just looking at the buried fire. Even if he managed to get the fire going again, he would probably lose several toes. His fingers weren't moving anymore, so he wasn't pulling individual branches, but gathering them by handfuls. And George stood by and watched the whole thing. Daddy Pig was tormented by the thought that his feet were stiffening more and more. He began to feel envious of George, who was dressed very warmly and not wet. He couldn't get the match out of the box. While he was trying to stick it out, the whole pack fell into the snow. He wanted to pick them up, but he couldn't. His fingers wouldn't obey his will. The solution came. He pulled the match out with his teeth. He inhaled the acrid smoke and coughed. He couldn't get one match out of the pack, so he grabbed the whole pack with the palms of his hands. A bright flame erupted. He lit branches with it, and finally, he was able to get the fire going. He began to put small branches on the fire. Fire is life. It must not be missed. He looked around desperately and saw George, who had been standing next to him all this time. He was shocked to see this. However, Daddy Pig was beginning to lose his mind. a thought flashed through his mind. He remembered a story where someone had killed an animal and crawled inside the body to wait out the night. He would kill George and plunge his hands into its warm body to warm and revive them. Then he would build a new fire. Daddy Pig pounced on him, and then he realized that his hands couldn't grip and his fingers wouldn't bend. He squeezed George in his hands and stood like that for a while. He realized that it was physically impossible for him to kill George. At this moment, he realized the danger. It was no longer a question of whether he would freeze his fingers and toes off, or even whether he would lose his hands and feet. It was now a matter of life and death, and there was no hope of rescue. Panic-stricken terror seized him, and he ran. He ran without thought, without purpose, in a fear he had never felt before. The blood rushed a little to his limbs. Maybe if he kept running, his legs would warm up. Maybe he could even make it to the house where they were now celebrating a birthday. Sure, a few fingers and toes were frozen solid, but his friends would take care of him. But in his mind, he knew he didn't have long to live. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig are going out for the evening, leaving Grandpa Pig and Granny Pig to look after the children.
Oh, George, I put you to bed, but you're making noises. You know you can't stay up so late. I promised your parents you'd get a good sleep. You know what? I could tell you a bedtime story, but only if you promise to be quiet. Come on, go to bed. Once upon a time, in a beautiful castle, there lived a princess, and she was called the Sleepy Princess. She could sleep very long and deep, and she wanted to sleep all day long. And there was a little prince who lived with her, and he was very energetic, just the opposite of his sister. He only slept during the day, and at night he played with toys in this huge castle. That didn't like... Stop creaking the bed! So, if you don't distract me, I'll continue the story. Evening came, and the princess went to bed. But while she was trying to sleep, she was disturbed by the little...
Dinosaur!
Yes, by the dinosaur. There was a big, scary dinosaur living near this castle. The only thing that prevented him from eating everyone around was his poor, sun-sensitive eyesight. Every night he would peek into the room of the sleepy princess and stare intently. He would look all around the room waiting for her slightest movement. All the animals at the sight of him fled in terror. But that was their mistake. He noticed the movement. But the sleepy princess lay quietly. No noise would disturb her sleep. If she simply turned over on the other side, made some movement with her hand, and the dinosaur would have realized that in front of him, a live prey. It was morning, and the little prince, who had been playing inside the castle all night, went to his room to sleep. He slept a little, but it was enough to fill him up, and in the afternoon, he woke up and ran outside to jump in the muddy puddles with his sister. In the evening, he gave his sister a wreath of flowers and ran away to play with toys. As soon as the sleepy princess lay down on her bed, she fell asleep immediately. The dinosaur came again, but this time a bee flew in, smelling the flowers.
Grandpa Pig, open the door. Peppa wants to go to bed.
I'm almost done. Just wait a bit.
I heard what you were telling him. Open the door or I'll call Mummy Pig.
The small prince came in the morning to see how the sleepy princess was doing. Now he was truly afraid of this dinosaur. He no longer felt safe in the castle and tried to find a place to hide. Finally, he found a place to hide and sat there listening to the ground shake with every step of the dinosaur. In the morning, he went out and lay down on the bed in his room, but he couldn't sleep. He was worried about what had happened to the sleepy princess. And the night he still sat in the uncomfortable chest as well. Finally, he seemed to calm down, lay down on his bed in the morning, and more sleepy than ever, he finally fell asleep. and he woke up to a strange noise. He slept for over 10 hours, which he had never done in his life. His heart beat very fast and he was suddenly short of breath. But he held back from breathing too deeply because the dinosaur would notice. But because of the broken wall at the top, the castle began to crumble. And all he could do was lie still until it collapsed. The tower collapsed on the dragon. That's how they defeated it. The end.
Peppa always dreamed of having a pet. She often asked her parents to buy a guinea pig or a parrot, but every time they refused. They said that caring for these animals was too complicated. Her parents were especially negative when she brought a wild animal. They told her she had a fish called Goldie, but she couldn't play with the fish in her dollhouse. One day she went to the bathroom and saw a spider in the sink. She remembered watching a program on TV before. Spiders are completely harmless, and they are more afraid of you than you are of them. She picked it up and carried it to her room. It was now her new pet, but she realized that Mummy Pig would not be happy about it. She felt a sharp pain, but didn't think much of it. But soon her arm became red and numb. Peppa was afraid to tell her mum and convinced herself that spiders are safe. In a minute, she felt so sick that she didn't even think about where the spider had run off to. She felt dizzy and her temperature rose. She didn't want to accept the fact that something bad was happening. She felt like she just needed to rest. Her arms weren't working. Her whole body was cramping. And when she fell, she realized she needed help. She tried to scream, but the anaphylactic shock made it sound more like a wheeze. She crawled to the door, hoping her mum would come to help. But her strength left her. After a while, George went into the room. He saw his sister lying unconscious on the floor. He saw that her arm was swollen and her face was pale. He realized that something serious had happened. He ran to tell his mum, but when he turned around, he saw a spider near the stairs. George was very scared of the spider. He realized that the spider had done it. George closed the door and held it, his heart pounding with fear. He didn't know how to help his sister. No one could have heard his screams. He was afraid the spider would kill his parents, but there was nothing he could do to help.
Oh, that's a big one.
But as he was letting the spider outside, he heard screams. It was George who had been calling for help all this time. He ran to their room, forgetting to close the door, and saw George sitting in the corner, scared to death, and Peppa was lying unconscious and with a pale face. They called an ambulance, and Peppa went to the hospital with severe intoxication. And George took a long time to calm down. But eventually, he went to his bed. It was a hot summer day, and Peppa's family decided to go to the river to spend time together. Peppa couldn't wait to splash in the water with George and her parents. The river looked inviting. They spread out and fed the ducks. But Peppa, out of curiosity, decided to walk around and see what was nearby. After walking for a while, she saw a lake. The lake seemed quiet and peaceful, and there weren't even any ducks there. Peppa didn't hesitate and went into the water. The water was very warm, warmed by the rays of the sun. She splashed and played, not realizing that there might be dangers hiding in the water. However, she looked around and saw a sign. It was a sign that it was forbidden to swim in this place. Peppa got scared and climbed out of the lake and went back to her parents. She came back when her parents were already looking for her. She didn't tell where she was because she was afraid that her parents would scold her. Peppa's family had a great vacation that day. However, a few days after returning home, Peppa began to feel sick. She developed headaches, fever, and general weakness. Her parents, concerned about her condition, took her to the doctor. Mr. Brown Bear, after examining Peppa, assumed it was a cold and recommended rest. drinking plenty of water and some medication to relieve her symptoms. However, despite the treatment, Peppa's condition did not improve. She began to have memory problems, nausea, and constant headaches. A few days later, when Peppa still wasn't getting better, they went to the doctor again. This time, Mr. Brown Bear decided to do a more thorough examination. He said there is a disease that is now spreading and asked if she had been in contact with the water in the lakes lately. Peppa, a little embarrassed, admitted that she had been swimming in a small lake near the river. This alarmed the doctor, and he conducted additional tests. The results showed the presence of a bacterium that was affecting the brain. Immediately afterwards, Peppa was hospitalized for intensive treatment. Doctors began a course of antibiotics and other treatments to deal with the infection. Although Peppa's condition was stabilized, the infection left its effects. Her mental abilities decreased.